Hey guys, in this video we're going to be painting this nautical great unclean one, so let's get into it. We're going to start off with two thin coats of some Bugman's Glow mixed about 50-50 with Screaming Skull and just apply that all over the skin. Then I'm going to do a overbrush with some Screaming Skull mixed with a little bit of Bugman's Glow. And after that we're going to do a wash of Riken Flesh Shade all over the skin. So moving on to the highlighting of the skin, we're going to be using a couple techniques, including blending, which is basically just watering the paint down and sort of brushing in the direction that you want it to be a little bit lighter. We're also going to be just sort of stippling it on to kind of get some texture. So I'm starting out with some 50-50 of Bugman's Glow and Screaming Skull and just dabbing that on to the higher points, leaving some of that darker color in the recesses. And I'm just progressively mixing in some more Screaming Skull and just trying to pick out the higher areas. Again, we're doing sort of a blending technique, so we got the paint watered down and we're just focusing on the higher and higher points as we start mixing in more and more of the Screaming Skull. And having two colors like this where you're mixing it together allows you to blend things nicely. When you just mix a little more of the lighter color in, it gives you a nice natural transition. And I'm just using an old crusty brush, and that's good for stippling. It just gives you some nice texture, makes the blending look a little bit more natural. I'm gonna base coat all the wounds and open flesh in some Bugman's Glow. Then I'm going to shade all that with some Carroburg Crimson, and I'm also stippling on some Carroburg Crimson, a little bit watered down towards some of the boils and bumps on here, and kind of blending it towards those. And again, painting that into all the open wounds. And then I'm going to use some Carroburg Crimson and some Druchii Violet and blend it towards the wounds, making a transition from the skin color to the wounds, and just using those two colors interchangeably to have some variation in the color. I'm taking some Mephiston Red and doing a similar technique, and just to add some color variation on all the boils. I'm gonna base coat these tentacles in some Slanesh Gray, and I'm gonna start mixing in some Nagaroth Night to create some blending, creating a transition to a darker color as we get closer to the tip. And then I used a little bit of Abaddon Black mixed in at the very tip to make it darker. I'm taking some Slanesh Gray and just stippling that on around the wounds to transition it into the skin color a little bit more. I base coat this guy sticking out of the stomach with some Elysian Green, and I use some Screaming Skull towards the underside of him to give him some variation in color. I base coat this claw with some Mephiston Red mixed with some XV88, and then I do an overbrush with some XV88 to tone it down a little bit. I wash it with some Agrax Earthshade. I start mixing in some Screaming Skull with some XV88 to highlight that crab claw there. So when it comes to highlighting, I usually do it in about 3 stages. So for example, with this crab claw, we have the XV88 and the Screaming Skull. So the first highlight I do is going to be about a 50-50 mix of these two, and then I'm going to do a second highlight a little bit higher with mostly the Screaming Skull mixed in with a little bit of the XV88, and then I'm going to do a final one towards the very tip with the Screaming Skull. And it's a similar thing I do with a lot of the highlighting, like for example on the skin I'm using the Bugman's Glow about 50-50 with the Screaming Skull, and then mostly Screaming Skull, and then Screaming Skull directly for the final highest highlight. And you know, that's a way that I do a lot of the highlights. Dry brushing that Screaming Skull right at the tips of the claw points there. I'm using some 2 thin coats Dungeon Stone Gray to base coat the barnacles around the claw here, and then I'm going to water it down, and I'm going to blend the skin color in with the barnacles to create a transition there. And I'm going to take some Druchii Violet and do a little bit of that color in between the gray and the skin color to make it a little bit more interesting and add some color variation in there. I'm going to hit that with some Agrax Earthshade, and then I'm going to dry brush it with some Dungeon Stone mixed with Screaming Skull. And just like before, just mix in a little bit more Screaming Skull as we get higher. I painted in some Desert Yellow into the barnacles here onto the points, and I put some Agrax Earthshade and just dabbed off the excess there. I'm hitting this guy with some Elysian Green mixed with Screaming Skull, and again in the same way as before, just mixing in more of that Screaming Skull as we get to the higher points. That's a way I highlight quite a lot of things here, so stippling that on with an old brush again, smaller brush, just stippling that on there, watered down, using some Screaming Skull towards the very highest points. I'm highlighting the edges of the wounds with some Pink Horror, and then I'm going to take some Carroburg Crimson and dab some of that into the deepest recesses of the wounds to give them some more depth. I'm also going to take some Mephiston Red, watered down, and sort of blend that in there as well in different areas to make some variation in color, make it more interesting. I'm taking some Slanesh Gray and edge highlighting these tentacles here, and I'm going to start mixing in some Corax White as I get higher, and I'm just taking my detail brush and just doing sort of some lines, almost like an edge highlight, but just making some repeating lines to make an edge highlight across the tip of this thing here. Mixing in more Corax White as we get closer to the tips. Moving on to the metal, I'm base coating everything with some Monument Hobbies Black Brown. So we're going to be moving on to the rust now, and to simplify it, rust kind of transitions from a dark brown color, it transitions into reddish hues, into orange, and then finally into yellows towards more of the recesses. So we got our brown established there, and I'm just going to start stippling on some Mephiston Red, some red leather, and some black brown, just kind of mixing and matching it. I'm just getting some variation in color on there to begin with. And I'm going to start painting that red leather mixed in with a little bit of orange brown as I focus more towards the recesses. I'm using some wet watered down paint and an old brush and just sort of stippling it / blending it into the recesses, just creating a rough and textured look. And I'm just going to start mixing in more and more of the orange brown as I get closer and closer to the recesses, just patiently creating a transition. And I start using some Vallejo wood as well to create more of that yellowish hue as we get closer to the very crevices here. So you'll see me stipple on a little bit of paint onto the model, and then I'll dip my brush in some water and I'll just kind of brush towards the recess where I want it to be lighter, and that's kind of a technique to help get that soft transition. I'm also painting some streaks on here just with some watered down paint, just brushing downwards from some of these battle damage areas here. It's all about just being patient and taking your time, just transitioning from the colors to get a nice smooth blending. I'm taking some lead belcher with an old brush and just dry brushing that all over the metal. Just doing kind of subtle here, I want it to be mostly rusty. And then I'm going to come back with some black brown and dry brush over that a little bit just to dull down some of that metal again, just to keep it very rusty looking. So unfortunately I lost a bit of footage here, but what I did was I took some Vallejo water texture and I filled up the bottom half of his helmet to kind of make it look like there's liquid filling up the very bottom there. I hot glued a little piece of plastic, covering the bottom half of where his visor would be, and I use a teardropper to kind of fill in the bottom bit of his helmet with just small layers. It says not to fill it more than 3 millimeters thick, so I just did a couple layers and I built that up, but unfortunately I lost the footage there, but here's what it looks like. So moving on to I guess the final details here. I am painting over all the skin with Vallejo satin varnish, and then I'm using some Ard Coat gloss varnish over the tentacles and the wounds. I'm also doing a little bit of gloss varnish on the bottom of his face to make it look wet where his helmet is full of water. And I'm using some Blood for the Blood God technical paint mixed with a tiny bit of Abaddon black. And dabbing that on nice and thick with a small brush and kind of building it up mostly towards the bottom of the wounds as if the blood is kind of drained down into there. I'm also going to take my detail brush and just carefully make some blood streaks dripping down from some of the wounds. Not watering down the paint at all, keeping it nice and thick so that we get a little bit of a three-dimensional effect here. To make his visor, I cut a little piece of plastic. This is just some random plastic packaging I had laying around. I sanded it down a little bit to give it a bit more of a matte finish to make it look more like glass. And I used some Yoo-hoo glue that I carefully applied with a little metal tool here. And I just glued that plastic down to his visor. I was careful to avoid using super glue here as I didn't want it to fog up the visor and mess things up. I used a bit of Monument Hobbies black-brown primer and just watered that down and stippled it all across the visor to make it a little bit more faded and grimy looking. I then used some more Yoo-hoo glue and glued on the part of the visor here. So moving on to the base, I'm going to be creating a kind of liquid looking vibe, kind of as if he's coming up out of the ocean, kind of a shoreline type of thing, and I'm going to be creating some water. So what I did was I started out with some hot glue to create kind of some, waves and variation in the depth. I then used some Yoo-hoo glue to kind of smooth out the transitions between that hot glue and just the base itself, and to kind of create some texture. I wanted it to be a little bit bubbly and wavy. And then finally I used some Vallejo water texture, and so that's just to kind of create a transition from kind of the big globs and kind of smooth into more of the just flat surfaces. So just taking my hot glue gun and really building up some depth around, especially around the model's base and around all the little elements that I've put on to the base here. I've put a couple of details on here off camera. I'm not going super detail into those just for the sake of speed here, not making this video too crazy long. But I'm using this tool just to apply some Yoo-hoo glue to, again, create some variation in the texture and get into some of those smaller recesses like between his toes there. I am base coating all that with some Monument Hobbies black brown, and then I'm taking some Macragge blue and Abaddon black and painting that, just kind of mixing that, creating some different colors on the base. And then I'm taking the Vallejo water texture and putting that all over the base with a little bit of Nurgle's rot and a little bit of brown mixed in to make it a little bit more murky. You can see me using the eyedropper tool there and then spreading it around with a brush. I'm taking some texture paint and just filling this little gap around the visor, connecting it to the helmet here. You could use whatever texture paint like sterling mud you might have. I used some homemade stuff. I took some Nurgle's rot and mixed it with that Vallejo water texture, and I just stippled that on in certain areas after the first coat has dried, just to kind of create some variation, make a little bit of slime mixed in there. And then I started taking some Vallejo foam texture and I started trying to make some wave texture here. I mixed in a little bit of Nurgle's rot to give it more of a green hue to start with. And I just stippled that on with an old brush, trying to create some wave looking things, especially around the feet and the little whatever items I have here in the water, like the skulls and stuff. And I tried to transition it from more of a green to more of a white towards the higher parts. You can see me trying to create some kind of waves around behind him here in the water, just stippling that on in a rounded pattern, trying to make it look like he's wading through the water there. And you can see me just stippling on some pretty much just straight up white foam texture towards the very tips. I use a little bit of Ard Coat gloss varnish around the bottom of the feet to make them look like they're wet. So with that done, that's pretty much it. I painted the rim of the base with some Abaddon black, and he's pretty much finished. So thanks for checking out the video, and here's the reveal here.